Most people are stuck in the endless cycle of consumption, books, podcasts, videos, but the real breakthrough happens when you cross the threshold into production, and that is where knowledge compounds into value. In today's video, I'm going to be going through when to stop consuming and start producing, how I'm actively thinking about this, and how I'm actively using this inside Killer Chaos OS, which is our own internal operating system that governs how we're able to build backend infrastructure. And like always, the main mission of these videos is to build this Killer Chaos OS, our internal thinking OS, and ultimately to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So most people confuse consumption with progress. They read, listen, and watch endlessly, believing that more input equals more growth. And I think, in many stages, you ultimately understand that, hey, you feel like you're actively moving and things are moving and happening for you simply by just, for example, watching motivational videos and saying, hey, I'm getting all this motivation, and this is ultimately gonna pump me up to build what it is that I'm actively doing. But that motivation only lasts so long, and ultimately understanding that, hey, there's a certain threshold where, consuming, you need to move from that consuming quadrant into the production quadrant. But in reality, consumption is just one quadrant of the learning system. And I like to think of this learning system of two different parts, which is the consumption quadrant, and also the production quadrant, and understanding when to move specifically from the consumption quadrant and then move into the production quadrant, because that is where you're able to create value. And the more valuable one, is ultimately the quadrant of production. And through this quadrant of production, that is where you're ultimately able to create value, because you can use both of these as part of the learning system that ultimately fuels how you're able to build, and also understand that, hey, I need to ultimately stay on top of what is relevant today. But through that, I also need to understand that, hey, there is a threshold that I need to cross, and I need to make sure that I'm having an outlook outwards and also having an outlook inwards as well. And having a look inwards, I'm ultimately saying, hey, this system looks like this. Number one, which is intake, which is basically consumption, which is you gathering knowledge, context, and perspective. And this is, in many different forms. You watching a movie, you reading a podcast, or ultimately just consuming knowledge, which I think is the foundation of you ultimately moving into the production quadrant. Because I think it's ultimately, they go hand in hand together. And one cannot go without the other. That, hey, you producing, but you ultimately aren't gathering the knowledge. And I think both of them have to supplement each other. So ultimately understanding that, hey, each and every single day, in my instance, I'm ultimately gathering enough knowledge for me to move from the consumption phase or the consumption quadrant into the production quadrant, and understanding when I need to make that switch as well. Because you can gather so much information, you can gather so much knowledge, but ultimately there comes a point or a threshold in my mind that ultimately it does not serve you. It's not the best use case of your time. And ultimately understanding that is ultimately where the value lies. Basically crossing that threshold and moving back into the production quadrant, and saying, hey, number two is integration, where you ultimately make sense of what you've consumed, mapping it into your mental models, which I think is one of the most important things. That, hey, you've gotten this knowledge, you've basically gotten the context as well, and you've gotten the different perspectives. Now I'm taking this in and making sense of what it is that I've been able to basically consume, and mapping it into my mental models, and asking the questions of saying, hey, does this actively align with the way that I see the world and the way that my worldview currently sits? And if so, how can I actively integrate this into how I'm actively building what it is that I'm actively building for us, building backend systems, and understanding that, hey, this is also another crucial aspect to understand, that making sense of what it is that you've actively consumed. Does it actively help you along your mission? For me, I like to read books that ultimately fuel the mission. I think, one of the most important leverage points for me, going into the future, is ultimately just staying true to what it is that I truly believe, and enjoy. And I think that is ultimately gonna, transverse through time and ultimately fuel how I'm going to be able to build this learning system, even further. And then understanding that, hey, there's a third part to this, which is the production, where you actively create things. And this is basically where you're basically applying, testing, and producing outputs that create real value. So this is now you taking all the information or the knowledge that you've basically ingested and now actively applying it to the real world in real world use cases to say, hey, I've spent so much time learning about how to build websites, and now from learning how to build websites, I've learned, design and all these things. Now it makes sense to me based on my worldview. Now I'm actively applying it and I'm testing. Does this actively work? Does this, meet the requirements in the way that I had expected it to go? And also producing the outputs that create real value. Say, for example, you're now working with a client. Hey, now you've got this knowledge, you've made sense of it. Now you're actively implementing it into the solution that you're building for them. Does it actively, get the results that you actively were seeking for in the beginning? And then ultimately that allows you to create real value. But with that, you also need to run feedback loops, which is the fourth part of it, where basically you use the outcomes and responses from production to refine the system. Because in as much as you can, just use this knowledge that you've gathered and then, ingest it and then have this in a way that you ultimately understand it, and then, you're actively applying it as well, which is basically the production quadrant. Using this is ultimately good and dandy, but ultimately if you want to push the boundaries further and constantly stay ahead of the curve, you ultimately need to make sure that, hey, you're using outcomes plus responses from the production to ultimately refine this system. Because if you don't use these feedback loops, you're ultimately not innovating enough. You're not pushing the boundaries of what you think is possible today and moving it into a new realm tomorrow. Because I think one of the most important things is ultimately being a lifelong learner, and how you actively move towards that, I believe, is just through feedback loops. For example, with these daily videos, I was always constantly asking, hey, can someone please give me feedback, and someone please assist me, just give me feedback and like kind of bash me and roast me. And ultimately one of my friends was like, hey, one of the things that I would love to see from you a lot more within these daily videos is ultimately you making one small thing better. And through that, we've ultimately been able to, test different things that, we've always actively spoken about, to say, hey, maybe doing these daily videos, I got to a point where, hey, I'm not innovating enough. And through that feedback, those feedback loops, we were able to cross 1,300 views in a month, simply through just making one small tweak per video and making each video better and better than the last one. Ultimately was the feedback loops that ultimately are fueling how these videos are going to play out into the future. But not only that, using that also in the sense of building backend systems. For example, let's say, hey, we have an intake system that we're actively building, and then we get feedback that, hey, this intake system is adding too many steps, and then we can ultimately reassess and then delete, and then through that we can make it more seamless. Because I think one of the most important things is, in as much as you can gather so much information and then ingest it and then ultimately apply it, you also need to run those feedback loops, because those feedback loops also allow you to innovate and also refine the system a lot further than you would if you just took this information and then just applied it and say, hey, this is how I'm actively going to do this. And then you build that mental inertia, and through that mental inertia you simply just do not push the boundaries of what is possible. And I think that is a boring way to do it. I think always just trying to look to push the boundaries forward each and every single day, in terms of understanding when consumption now needs to turn into production as well, and saying, hey, the key insight here is there is a threshold where consumption is enough. Ultimately understanding that, hey, there reaches a point where you ultimately need to understand that you've consumed enough and you actively just need to take action. And through this point, you ultimately see the marginal returns in reading more videos, more podcasts shrinks. You ultimately see that, hey, this value that you thought you were producing over time ultimately is shrinking, simply because you're not getting as much as you possibly could out there. And ultimately understanding that if you don't cross into the production, you stay trapped in the illusion of progress. And I think this is one of the most important things, to ultimately understand that, hey, there is a point in time where you ultimately need to stop consuming and just, produce. And I've caught myself so many times, in that phase where, hey, I feel like I'm making progress. I feel like all these different things are happening, but then I have to kind of, catch myself and say, hey, you're not producing enough. And where does the value lie? It's ultimately in production. And how do I actively think in terms of, if I want to build, these backend systems, if I want to build, the thinking OS, and ultimately transverse this in terms of, what the main vision for Killer Chaos OS is, I ultimately need to understand when to make that switch from the consumption quadrant and cross into the production quadrant, which is also super important. And then understanding that, hey, through this, we understand that systems thinking tells us that more inputs or inputs without outputs equals entropy, and balanced feedback loops equals compounding. Because I think both of these, go hand in hand to ultimately understand that, hey, inputs without outputs ultimately mean to entropy, and also understanding that, this compounding is done through feedback loops, and these feedback loops are ultimately going to govern how we're going to be able to build into the future. And I think this is really important to ultimately just hammer down, because the real leverage is not in consuming more. At least from my own personal experience, it hasn't, led me down the path that ultimately has, ultimately got me to building the vision of Killer Chaos OS, because I have to catch myself sometimes, when I'm consuming a bit too much and saying, hey, is this actively helping me? And asking the questions of saying, hey, is this actively fueling the next generation of Killer Chaos OS? Is it giving me the knowledge that I need to move to the next level? And recognizing that when you've consumed enough to act, then deliberately moving towards the production quadrant. Because I think when you've reached that point, when you actively understand that, hey, I've learned enough, I've, consumed enough knowledge from books, you understand that if you read another book, it's not really going to change things. The only thing that's going to change things is ultimately just taking that action that moves you, that moves you towards your goal, and understanding that, hey, I need to now flip the script and cross from the consumption quadrant into the production quadrant. And how do I actively do that? I need to understand that, hey, I need to catch myself when I am consuming too much, and then understanding that because the real value in the world is only created through production. The realest value in the world, all these things that you see, the biggest companies, Microsoft, Apple, all these different companies, they consume knowledge in the beginning, early, and I think they still do to a certain extent, but most of the time they're producing. And I think there is some truth in that transverses through time, where you can say, hey, you see all these people doing all these things, making content and doing all these things. Ultimately, the one mode that they have, or that they're super making apparent, is ultimately that they're producing a lot more, and through that production they're ultimately creating value. And how do I build enough knowledge or consume enough to the point where I say, hey, this feels like progress, but it's not really progress, and now I need to make the flip or transition or cross into the production quadrant. And understanding that, hey, consumption upgrades you. I think consumption is one of the best things to ultimately seek knowledge, and ultimately understand that, hey, we're building towards a goal, but we're not going to do that stagnant. We need to constantly be truth seeking to say, hey, we need to learn as much as we possibly can that makes sense and is aligned with what it is that we're actively striving to solve for, but also understanding that production upgrades the world. Production is where all the value is created, and ultimately understanding that we need to use these two in a manner that creates leverage for us to say, hey, each and every single day we're focusing on both quadrants and not just leaning on one quadrant alone, but we're basically focusing on, hey, we're doing 50-50 in the production quadrant, or we're doing 80-20 20% of active learning and 80% of the production quadrant. Also just balancing that out, and ultimately understanding that learn enough to build, then build to learn. And I think this is going to be super valuable into the future. Ultimately understanding that we need to make sure that each and every single day we're learning to build, but ultimately through that we're building to learn, because each and every single day we're ultimately going to keep pushing the needle forward in what we think is possible today into a new realm of reality tomorrow. And like I always say, we're going to fail so many times, but the things that we are actively going to get right, we're going to make sure that we're going to double down on that, and learn from both failures and successes, because there are always lessons through that, but also making sure that, hey, we're going to catch ourselves where we understand that, hey, we've crossed the threshold of consumption. Now we need to move into the production quadrant, because in as much as you can focus on one, they both go hand in hand, in my personal opinion, that you cannot do one without the other. And this, I believe, is going to be the foundation of how we're going to be actively building the next generation of backend systems, where we're going to build the main vision of Killer Chaos OS, where we're inspiring millions of people, redefining and reshaping industries, and having $100 million worth of impact, which is one future that I'm super excited to wake up to and think about each and every single day. And if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, share, comment, and also connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.